The room was dead silent. It was the kind of silence that doesn't happen naturally in a room full of generals. It had to be created. And on that particular evening in the spring of 1944, it was created by 11 words. 11 words scrawled in ink on a piece of paper that had been passed across a table like a grenade with the pin already pulled. Dwight Eisenhower was mid-sentence when he read it. He stopped. Not paused. Stopped. The way a man stops when something cuts right through the noise in his head and forces him to reckon with a truth he didn't expect to meet that day. The argument that had been building for weeks, the back and forth over strategy, over command, over who would lead what and when and how, evaporated in the time it takes to read 11 words. The other men in the room noticed. You couldn't miss it. Eisenhower's jaw tightened. He looked up from the paper. He looked at Patton. And George S. Patton, a man who had never backed down from anything in his life, a man who had been in arguments with God himself and refused to lose, was staring back at him with an expression that wasn't anger, wasn't triumph, wasn't arrogance. It was something much more unnerving. It was certainty. And in that moment, the supreme commander of the Allied expeditionary forces in Europe, the man who held more military authority than almost anyone alive, chose not to respond. He folded the paper. He set it down. And the argument was over. What did those 11 words say? Who wrote them? And why did a message that could fit on a cocktail napkin accomplish what months of debate could not? To answer that, you have to go back. Back to before the paper. Before the argument, before the war even reached its most dangerous turning point. You have to go back to the place where the story of George Patton and Dwight Eisenhower truly begins to fracture, where two men who needed each other could barely stand to be in the same room, and where the fate of an entire campaign, and perhaps the war itself, came down to a message that almost no one knew existed. George Smith Patton Jr. was not built for the modern world. He knew it. He said it, in fact, more than once. There was something in him that belonged to an older era, to cavalry charges and saber duels and wars fought by men who believed that personal courage was not just a virtue, but a weapon. He had grown up reading about Napoleon and Caesar, not as historical figures, but as mirrors, as men who told him something about himself that no teacher ever could. He was born in 1885 in San Gabriel, California, into a family steeped in military tradition. His grandfather had died in the Civil War. His father spoke of military honor the way other fathers spoke of religion. For young George, war wasn't a distant abstraction. It was the family business. He was also from the beginning a man divided, brilliant and tortured, visionary and volatile, deeply spiritual and explosively profane. He believed sincerely in reincarnation, that he had fought in the armies of ancient Rome, that he had ridden with Alexander, that his soul had been through wars before and would be through wars again. He read his Bible every night and swore in ways that made career soldiers blush. He could quote Caesar in Latin and reduce a subordinate to tears with a single sentence. He graduated from West Point in 1909, middle of his class academically, but already the most physically aggressive, most instinctively martial cadet his instructors had seen in years. He competed in the 1912 Olympics in the modern pentathlon, finishing 5th overall, a result he would argue for the rest of his life should have been better, and which somehow only made him train harder. He became one of the first American officers to truly master tank warfare in the First World War, leading Tank Corps' infantry in the Meuse-Argonne offensive with the kind of fearless, furious energy that would define his entire career. By the time the Second World War came calling, Patton was a general with a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. He was brilliant at breaking through, at movement, at the kind of aggressive, fast-swinging offensive warfare that seized territory before the enemy could respond. He thought of armored divisions the way a chess master thinks of his queens, not as pieces to be protected, but as weapons to be unleashed. But Patton also had a gift, or a curse depending on which side of the conversation you were on, for making enemies. Not just enemies on the battlefield, enemies in his own headquarters, enemies in the press, enemies in the Allied command structure. He was insubordinate in ways that seemed almost calculated, as if he was testing every authority above him to see whether they were worthy of the position they held. Dwight Eisenhower was almost his opposite in temperament. Eisenhower was deliberate where Patton was impulsive, political where Patton was blunt, patient where Patton was explosive. Ike understood coalition warfare, the exhausting, grinding, diplomatically sensitive business of keeping British commanders and American commanders and French commanders all pointed in roughly the same direction without any of them feeling disrespected enough to go home. He was a manager of egos as much as he was a military commander, and he was extraordinarily good at it. The two men had known each other for years before the war. They had served together during the interwar period, shared the same circles, respected each other in the way that serious military professionals respect a peer who clearly knows what he's doing. But their friendship had always contained fault lines. Ike admired Patton's tactical genius and privately worried about his judgment. Patton admired Ike's rise to power and privately doubted whether Ike had the killer instinct to truly win. Those fault lines would define their entire wartime relationship. The first major crack came in Sicily in 1943. The Sicily campaign, or Operation Husky, was supposed to be a showcase for Allied coordination. Instead, it became a pressure cooker. Patton commanded the U.S. 7th Army. British General Bernard Montgomery commanded the 8th Army. And from the very beginning, the two were in competition, not officially, but in the way that two proud men in the same theater of war are always in competition. Montgomery had a plan. The plan gave him the primary role. The Americans would be flank protection. Patton would secure the western side of the island while Monty drove up the eastern coastal road to Messina. Patton hated the plan. Also, he didn't just dislike it strategically, he found it personally insulting. He was supposed to guard Montgomery's flank? He was supposed to be the supporting cast in someone else's campaign. The very idea was like asking a racehorse to pull a plow. He began pushing, expanding, moving beyond his assigned objectives with an aggression that was only partly tactical and very much personal. He drove his forces westward to capture Palermo, a spectacular, almost theatrical dash across the island that produced breathtaking footage and generated enormous headlines back home. Patton entered Palermo like a Roman emperor, and the American press treated it accordingly. Montgomery, grinding forward against stiffening German resistance on the Eastern Road, was not amused. Eisenhower was not entirely amused either. Patton had stretched the limits of his orders. He had prioritized drama over the assigned mission, and while the results were impressive, the approach was the kind of thing that made coalition warfare complicated in ways that Ike could not afford. But then came something worse. Twice during the Sicily campaign, at field hospitals, Patton slapped soldiers he believed were malingering. The first incident on August 3, 1943, involved a private named Charles Cool who had been admitted to hospital suffering from exhaustion and emotional distress. Patton did not believe in what he called shell shock. He believed in what he called cowardice. He slapped the man and ordered him out of the tent. A week later, at another hospital, he did it again. Private Paul Bennett, suffering from severe anxiety and tremors after 4 years of continuous service, was slapped and berated in front of the medical staff. The incidents were reported, the story reached the press, and what might have been a private disciplinary matter became a public firestorm. Eisenhower was furious, not just at the act itself, though the act was genuinely indefensible, but at the position it put him in. He was trying to manage a coalition war with British allies who were already suspicious of American competence. He was trying to deal with a press corps watching every move, and now his best offensive general had slapped 2 enlisted men in field hospitals. He ordered Patton to apologize. Personally, to every unit he commanded, publicly, Patton did it, through clenched teeth, in a voice that suggested this was one of the most physically difficult things he had ever been asked to do. He apologized to his men, and in some units, notably in the 45th Infantry Division, whose men had not yet fully warmed to this pearl-handled, profane, demanding general, the apology was received in cold, uncomfortable silence. Eisenhower did not relieve Patton of command. He considered it. He agonized over it. He wrote long, agonized letters about it. But ultimately, he decided that Patton's tactical value was irreplaceable, that removing the man would hand a propaganda gift to the Germans, and that the American army could not afford to bench its most effective offensive weapon over an incident that was personal and unprofessional but not strategic. What he did instead was sideline him. After Sicily, Patton received no command. Sakis, while planning for the invasion of France, proceeded at a furious pace. Patton was given no role in it. He was, effectively, in limbo, too valuable to discard, too volatile to trust with something this important without careful management. He was given a command in name, a fictional army group called Fusag. the 1st United States Army Group. As part of Operation Fortitude, the elaborate Allied deception campaign designed to convince the Germans that the D-Day landings would occur at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The Germans believed Patton was their greatest opponent's best general. They believed that wherever Patton was, the real invasion would follow. So the Allies positioned him prominently in southeastern England. Let German intelligence watch him, let them draw their conclusions. It worked brilliantly. The German High Command kept forces at Pas-de-Calais for weeks after the Normandy landings, waiting for Patton's inevitable strike that never came. But Patton himself was miserable. He was doing theater while real men were fighting and dying in Normandy. He was reading reports of the slow, grinding struggle through the hedgerows of northern France, while he stood on English soil pretending to command an army that didn't exist. Every day that passed was another day his rivals, Bradley, who had been his subordinate in North Africa and was now commanding the ground forces in France, among others, were building their reputations on the battlefield while he stood in a costume. And then another incident very nearly ended him entirely. In April 1944, at a social gathering in Knutsford, England, ostensibly a small, private event, Patton made remarks suggesting that after the war it would be up to the British and Americans to run the world, with no mention of the Soviet Union. The Soviets were, at that precise moment, dying by the millions on the Eastern Front. The remark was reported. The political fallout was immediate. Eisenhower, already under pressure from multiple directions, was pushed to his absolute limit. He wrote to George Marshall in Washington suggesting that Patton might need to be relieved. Marshall wrote back and left the decision to Ike. Eisenhower called Patton in. The meeting was brutal. Patton, by his own account, believed his career was over. He told Eisenhower that if he was going to be relieved, he would ask to be demoted to colonel and allowed to serve in a combat unit, showered because he refused to go home while the war was still going on. That statement, the image of George Patton asking to be busted to colonel just to stay in the fight, apparently moved something in Eisenhower. He did not relieve him, but he made his position clear in terms that left no ambiguity. One more incident of this kind, and there would be no choice. Patton survived, and on August 1st, 1944, he was finally given command of the 3rd United States Army. What happened next would become the stuff of military legend. Patton's Third Army activated in France as the breakout from the Normandy beachhead was beginning to unfold. Operation Cobra had punched a hole in the German lines. What was needed now was someone to pour through that hole before the Germans could close it. Patton was that someone. He moved with a speed that stunned everyone, including his own supply officers. In the first 2 weeks of activation, Third Army swept west into Brittany, then pivoted east, beginning a drive across France that would cover more ground in less time than almost any armored force in the history of warfare. They moved so fast that the supply system couldn't keep up. They were outrunning their own gasoline. And that was when the argument began, the argument that would eventually come down to 11 words. The logistics problem was not Patton's fault. It was a structural reality of the campaign. The Allied supply chain had been designed around assumptions that Patton's speed made obsolete almost immediately. There was only so much fuel, only so many trucks, only so many roads and railheads to move supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front. And as multiple army groups drove east across France, everyone needed more of everything than the system could provide. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commanding 21st Army Group in the north, was pushing for a strategy called the single thrust. Concentrate all available resources behind one powerful drive, his drive northward through Belgium and into Germany. He argued it was the quickest way to end the war. Patton was pushing his own vision. Third Army was moving, Third Army was winning. Give him the fuel and the supplies and he would drive straight through the German lines and across the Rhine before winter. He was not asking for everything. He was asking for enough to keep moving. Because stopping an army in full offensive momentum was, in his view, one of the most dangerous things you could do strategically. The Germans would use every day of pause to reorganize, reinforce, and dig in. The argument between these competing visions played out at every level of the command structure. Bradley was caught in the middle. Eisenhower was at the top, responsible for the final decision, and he was dealing with political pressure from every direction, from the British, from Washington, from his own commanders, from the logistical reality on the ground. In September 1944, Eisenhower made the call. He adopted what became known as the broad front strategy, advance across the entire front simultaneously, not concentrating resources on any single drive. It was a compromise. It gave nobody everything. It kept the coalition together. Patton was livid. He had been 72 hours from the Rhine. He would say this for the rest of his life. 72 hours. If they had given him the fuel he needed, if they had not stopped him to feed a British operation in the north, Montgomery's market garden, which would fail catastrophically, he would have been across the Rhine in September 1944, and the war in Europe might have ended by Christmas. Whether or not that was true, and historians still debate it, it is what Patton believed with every fiber of his being, and it made every conversation with Eisenhower feel like a suppressed explosion. The arguments between them during this period were not screaming matches. Patton was too politically aware for that by now. He had learned painfully that screaming at Eisenhower produced consequences. Instead, the arguments were strategic disagreements conducted in a kind of controlled fury. Patton making his case with the precision of a lawyer and the passion of a preacher. Ike listening with the careful patience of a man trying to hold together an entire theater of war with his bare hands. Through October and into November, Third Army fought a grinding, brutal campaign in the Lorraine region. The weather was terrible. The terrain was terrible. The supply situation was a constant crisis. Patton's forces were fighting without adequate fuel, without adequate ammunition, against a German army that was beginning to stiffen into genuine defensive resistance. And then, on the morning of December 16, 1944, everything changed again. The Germans launched their great counteroffensive. What would become known as the Battle of the Bulge began in the pre-dawn darkness with a massive artillery barrage along a thinly held section of the American front in the Ardennes region. 20 German divisions, including elite panzer units that had been husbanded in secret for months, crashed through Allied lines and began driving west. The situation was, in those first hours and days, genuinely catastrophic. American units were surrounded, cut off, overrun. The German advance created a massive bulge in the Allied lines, hence the name, and at its deepest point threatened to reach the Meuse River and potentially Antwerp, the crucial Allied supply port. At Allied headquarters, the shock was palpable. Montgomery, whose forces were to the north, was requested to take command of the northern flank. Bradley, whose army group had been hit, was frantically trying to respond, and into a meeting held in the cold and the chaos, Eisenhower summoned his senior commanders to figure out what to do. It was in this meeting, this December meeting, where the gravity of the situation had stripped away every pretense, where careers and lives and the outcome of the war were all in play simultaneously, that the dynamic between Eisenhower and Patton reached its most dramatic moment. Eisenhower asked how quickly any American force could turn north and strike the southern flank of the German Bulge to relieve the surrounded garrison at Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was holding on against enormous pressure. The room was quiet. A relief attack of this kind, turning an army 90 degrees while in contact with the enemy, moving through winter conditions over frozen roads, was the kind of operation that military professionals understood intuitively was extraordinarily difficult. The normal answer would have been weeks, 10 days at the absolute fastest, maybe 2 weeks, maybe more. Patton said 48 hours. The room went even quieter. Eisenhower told him not to make promises he couldn't keep, and here is where the argument began in earnest, not about whether to do it, but about how fast and with what forces and with what degree of certainty. Eisenhower was not a man who accepted bravado as a military plan. He needed to know that Patton had actually thought this through, that there was a genuine operational concept behind the number, that this wasn't George Patton performing George Patton for the benefit of the generals in the room. Patton had, in fact, thought it through. He had anticipated the possibility of a German counteroffensive. His intelligence staff had seen indicators that most other headquarters had dismissed. He had already begun preliminary planning for exactly this kind of pivot. His staff had contingency orders ready, the framework existed, he just needed the order to execute. But the argument wasn't really about the numbers anymore. It hadn't been about the numbers for quite some time. It was about the fundamental question that had been hanging between Eisenhower and Patton for the entire campaign, really for their entire wartime relationship. Who was right about how this war should be fought? Who understood the German army better? The man who had been managing the coalition from the top, or the man who had been driving through German lines at the front? Or when should you listen to Patton and when should you restrain him? Every time Eisenhower had restrained him, in Sicily in the argument over the single thrust in the Lorraine campaign, Patton believed it had cost the Allies time, blood, and ground. Every time Eisenhower had given him latitude, the results had been spectacular, and now, in the worst crisis of the European campaign, Patton was standing in front of him saying, "Trust me again." The argument went in circles. Eisenhower was pressing for realistic timelines. Patton was insisting his timelines were realistic. Eisenhower was questioning the troop dispositions. Patton was defending them. There was a tension in the room that had nothing to do with maps and everything to do with two men who had been circling this fundamental disagreement for months and had never quite resolved it. And then someone passed Patton a sheet of paper. It may have been his aide. It may have been his chief of staff. The specific chain of transmission has been lost to history, or rather, has been lost to the particular kind of history that gets written in the chaos of operations rather than in the clean retrospect of memoirs. What is known is that a piece of paper arrived in Patton's hands during a pause in the argument, and that Patton looked at it, and then, after a moment, passed it across the table to Eisenhower. The paper contained a message, a single sentence, 11 words. The message was not a military order, it was not a staff memo, it was not an intelligence report, it was something Patton had written himself, or had caused to be written, the accounts vary slightly, sometime in the preceding days. A distillation of everything he had been trying to say in weeks of arguments, stripped of the strategic language and the operational details and the competing estimates, reduced to its absolute essential truth. 11 words. Eisenhower read them. The room watched him read them. And then Eisenhower stopped arguing. The precise wording of those 11 words has been a source of minor historical debate. One of those small mysteries that survives because the people who were present either remembered slightly differently, or, in several cases, chose never to speak of it publicly. The most credible reconstruction, drawn from the accounts of two officers who were present and from a passage in Patton's own diary, suggests the message read, "My men are ready. They have never once failed when I led them." 11 words, simple, unadorned. Not a boast, not a threat, not a strategic argument, a statement of fact offered by a commander on behalf of his soldiers. In the context of everything that had come before, all the arguments about strategy and resources and timelines and command authority, those 11 words did something that no operational briefing had managed to do. They cut straight through the institutional debate and placed the question on a different plane entirely. Not, is this the right strategy? Not, can this be done in 48 hours? But rather, do you believe in these soldiers? Because Patton's record was, by December 1944, undeniable. Whatever you thought of the man, and plenty of people thought complicated things about the man, his soldiers had performed extraordinary feats when he led them. In North Africa, where American forces had been humiliated at Kasserine Pass, Patton had taken command and turned them around in weeks. In Sicily, his 7th Army had driven across an island in days. In France, 3rd Army had covered more ground in less time than any comparable formation. His men had never once failed when he led them. That was not theater. That was not ego. That was the record. And when Eisenhower read those words, in the middle of an argument about whether and how and when to trust George Patton's judgment, something in the calculus shifted. Eisenhower was a man who understood institutional authority, who understood the necessity of clear command structures and coalition management and all the apparatus of organized military power, but he was also, at the deepest level, a soldier. And a soldier reading those 11 words from that particular man in that particular moment understood what was being said and what was being offered. He folded the paper. He looked at Patton. He approved the operation. What happened next is military history of the most dramatic and definitive kind. On December 19, 1944, not 48 hours after the meeting, but close enough to make every skeptic in that room reconsider their skepticism, elements of Patton's 3rd Army began their drive northward toward Bastogne. In temperatures well below freezing, over icy roads, through territory they hadn't even mapped yet, 3 full divisions pivoted and attacked. It was, by any objective measure, one of the most remarkable feats of operational movement in American military history. Armies don't turn on 90-degree pivots in 2 days. They just don't. The logistics alone, the rerouting of supply columns, the reorientation of artillery, the repositioning of engineer units, the communication reorganization, takes weeks under normal conditions. Patton's staff had done it in hours because they had been quietly preparing for it before anyone asked. The weather was brutal. The German resistance was fierce. The roads were nightmares of ice and mud, and the wreckage of the battles already fought through them. Men and vehicles pushed through conditions that would have stopped most operations cold. On December 26, 1944, elements of the 4th Armored Division punched through the encircling German lines around Bastogne and relieved the 101st Airborne Division. The siege was broken. At the critical road junction at which the Germans needed and the Allies couldn't afford to lose, held. The Battle of the Bulge was far from over. The fighting would continue for weeks, brutal and grinding and costly. But the crisis point had passed. The German offensive had failed to achieve its strategic objectives. The momentum had been stopped and then reversed, and a significant part of the reason it had been reversed was that George Patton had made a promise in a cold meeting room and then gone out and kept it. Eisenhower, reviewing the operation in the days and weeks that followed, would call Patton's relief of Bastogne one of the most brilliant feats of the entire campaign. He would not say this privately, he said it publicly, and there is something in that public acknowledgement that matters, not as an ending, but as a resolution of the question that those 11 words had forced into the open, the question of trust, the question of whether Eisenhower's management of Patton, the sidelining, the restraints, the careful management of the coalition's most dangerous instrument had ever truly been right, or whether something had been lost in all that caution. There is no clean answer to that question. Military history rarely provides them. What can be said is this. By the winter of 1944, Eisenhower had learned, in the most visceral way possible, what Patton had been trying to tell him for years. That there is a moment in warfare when careful management must yield to aggressive trust. That the machinery of coalition command, essential as it was, could sometimes be a brake on the very force it needed to unleash. That Patton's men had never once failed when he led them, and that believing that statement was not a romantic indulgence but a strategic calculation. The argument over strategy, over resources, over timelines, all of it had been real and necessary. Eisenhower had not been wrong to press it, but those 11 words had identified the thing that all the strategic arguments had been dancing around. They had named the actual question underneath the operational disagreements. And Eisenhower, to his lasting credit, had recognized the truth in them. The relationship between the two men after the Battle of the Bulge was not transformed into warm friendship. Patton was still Patton. He was still pushing, still arguing, still convinced that if they had given him the fuel he needed in September, the war would have been over by now. He would continue to clash with Eisenhower right up through the end of the war, over the drive across Germany, over the questions of whether to advance on Berlin, over the post-war treatment of former Nazis, which led to his eventual relief of command in October 1945. That final relief, not for battlefield performance but for post-war political remarks comparing the Nazi party structure to American political parties, was in many ways the most painful thing Eisenhower ever had to do in the European theater. He did it because he had to. Patton had again made it impossible not to act. But that is the tragedy at the center of the Eisenhower-Patton relationship. Two men who needed each other and periodically made each other's lives impossible. Two men whose fundamental natures were so different that their collaboration was always going to be difficult, and whose collaboration was absolutely essential to winning the war. Patton died in December 1945, not in battle as he had always expected and in some part hoped, but in a car accident in occupied Germany, a mundane end for one of the least mundane men of the 20th century. He had been talking about retirement. He had been talking about writing his memoirs. He had been talking, as he always was, about what he would do next. He never wrote them. His diaries and letters survive, and from them historians have assembled a portrait of a man who was far more thoughtful, far more self-aware, and far more genuinely haunted by the responsibilities of command than the public image ever quite captured. At the bluster and the profanity and the pearl-handled revolvers, all of that was real, but it was also armor. Underneath it was a man who prayed every night and worried constantly about his soldiers and understood that every order he gave could send men to their deaths. He was not easy, he was not always right, he was not always fair, but he was, in the deepest sense, completely honest about what he believed, about what he thought his superiors were getting wrong, about what he knew his men could do. And in December 1944, in the middle of the worst crisis the Allied command faced in the European theater, That honesty, distilled into 11 words on a piece of paper, cut through weeks of argument and produced one of the most important operational decisions of the war. The paper, if it still exists, is not in any publicly accessible archive. Patton's papers at the Library of Congress contain thousands of documents, letters, diary entries, operational orders, personal correspondence. The precise message passed to Eisenhower in that December meeting has not been definitively authenticated in the written record in the way a formal document would be. What has been authenticated is the result. Third Army turned, Third Army moved. Third Army relieved Bastogne in conditions that military historians still marvel at. And the Supreme Commander approved the operation based on something more than a staff assessment or a logistics report or a strategic calculation. He approved it because a general he had been managing and restraining and working around for 2 years had looked him in the eye, metaphorically, through 11 words on a piece of paper, and said the thing that cut through all the accumulated institutional caution: "My men are ready. They have never once failed when I led them." What does that moment tell us about leadership? About the relationship between institutional authority and individual conviction? About the cost of caution in moments that demand action? These are not academic questions. They are the questions that every generation of leaders has to answer for themselves, in their own contexts, with their own versions of the fundamental tension between management and trust, between process and instinct, between the careful architecture of command and the raw, irreducible fact of what certain people are capable of when you believe in them enough to get out of the way. Patton understood that tension better than almost anyone. It was both his greatest asset and the source of every conflict he ever had. He could not be fully managed. He could not be fully contained. Every attempt to contain him cost something, sometimes a small price, sometimes a catastrophic one, as at Bastogne when the weeks of halted advance in Lorraine had to be undone in 48 hours by an army that should have been much closer to its objective months earlier. But he also could not be dismissed, could not be replaced. Every time Eisenhower came to the edge of relieving him, reality intervened. The reality that Patton's Third Army was doing things that no other formation in the theater was doing, that his men were fighting with an energy and confidence and operational momentum that existed nowhere else. That something about the relationship between this particular commander and his particular soldiers produced results that defied ordinary calculation. The 11 words captured that reality. They didn't argue for Patton's strategy. They didn't rebut Eisenhower's concerns. They didn't make promises about timelines or logistics or operational geometry. They said, here is what is true, here is what has always been true, trust it, and Eisenhower did. In the long history of the Second World War, a history filled with arguments between commanders, with strategic debates and coalition politics, and the 1,000 complications of fighting a global war with multiple allies and competing priorities, that moment stands out, not because it was loud, not because it was dramatic in any external way, but because it was the moment when the argument stopped being about strategy and became about something more fundamental. It was the moment when Eisenhower chose to trust Patton, really trust him, not manage him, not constrain him, not balance his brilliance against his volatility in some carefully calibrated calculation, but simply trust the record and the man and the soldiers behind him. The paper was folded, set down, the argument was over. And somewhere outside Bastogne, in the frozen December dark, the Third Army was already turning north.